Hello,
Hello.
and we are on air, and it's great to see everybody here today. My name is Gareth Mitchell, and I'm your friendly host for proceedings today, and we're in for a fantastic session. So, welcome along to this Frontiers Deep Dive, and it's fantastic to see viewers from across the continent. So, in fact, we've had over 700 registrations from 98 countries, including from the world's leading universities, research institutes, and international organizations. So, whatever the time zone, you're in great company and it's wonderful to have you along. Now, if you're new to Frontiers in Science, this is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal at Frontiers, and we publish exceptional peer reviewed lead articles on transformational science addressing the big challenges facing us all and, of course, our planet. And we publish these articles across unique hubs with content to suit all kinds of audiences, extending our reach and impact for people engaged in science, policy, and society. To date, we've published 29 hubs spanning over 110 articles that cover a diverse spectrum of transformational science. The research has been cited over 1,000 times, it's been viewed over 3.5 million times, and is regularly picked up by the media. So today's deep dive focuses on this lead article. It's titled Plastic Pollution Under the Influence of Climate Change, Implications for the Abundance, Distribution and Hazards in Terrestrial and Aquatic Ecosystems. The lead author is Professor Frank Kelly, and we're very proud to host the article in Frontiers in Science. So, up for discussion today, two of the big challenges of our time: climate change and pollution from plastics. Two problems with their own science, their own policies, their own complexities and solutions. But are these global problems really that separate? Today's lead article says that these issues are actually really interlinked. Okay, so of course we already know that producing and consuming plastics releases more greenhouse gases and that drives climate change. But today's lead article kind of turns that on its head. It shows that the link between these harms works the other way around too. In other words, climate change worsens the plastics problem. In short, the planet is warming, so plastics are breaking down more quickly, and that's dumping more of the stuff into the environment. There are other mechanisms too, as we'll hear. And of course, on the face of it, this is a terrible story. I mean, climate change is bad, so is plastic pollution. And these two are now feeding each other. We know that. And it's kind of scary. But at Frontiers, we acknowledge, of course, the bad sides, of course, but we are all about solutions here too. So now we know much more about just how interconnected climate change and plastic pollution are, then surely the solutions are equally interlinked. So, our experts today are calling not just for a more joined up scientific response, but also a joined up response when it comes to governance and policy, especially now that we have the data, the analysis, and the science in the lead article to back all that up. As for our discussion, while I'm expecting, of course, some tough questions, that's why we're here in many ways, but I also expect that something hopeful and indeed doable will emerge today. Now, before we jump in, I just want to tell you about these amazing range of resources that we have for you to read and share. This is the Article Hub, and alongside the lead article, we also have an editorial by Dr. Davy Jones from Environment Centre Wales, School of Environmental and Natural Sciences in Bangor University in the UK. Then we have three Viewpoints articles. One is by Dr. Jennifer Provencher from Environment and Climate Change Canada, who's joining us as a guest panelist today. We also have a viewpoint from Professor Daniel Richkoff from the Division of Marine Science and Conservation, Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University Marine Laboratory in the US. And another viewpoint from Professor Mario Barletta of the Department of Oceanography at the Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil. And that's the most recent addition to our article hub. Then there's a policy outlook by our guest panelist, Dr. Anya Brandon from Ocean Conservancy and in the USA. And the hub also includes a lay explainer and a video. And I'll tell you what, there's even a version of the lead article in Frontiers for Young Minds. That's our science journal for kids. So there you go, plenty of reading and viewing for you. So, as for today, let's just tell you what's going on. This is our schedule for the session. First, we're going to hear from three authors of the lead article, Professor Frank Kelly and also Guy Woodward, and Dr. Stephanie Wright. And then joining us for the panel discussion, we'll have Dr. Anya Brandon and Dr. Jennifer Provencher. So let's get into it. And first, I'm very delighted to welcome Frank Kelly. He's Professor of Community Health and Policy at Imperial College London. He also holds the inaugural Humphrey Babcock Chair in Community Health and Policy at Imperial and is Director of the Environmental Research Group. And that is a leading centre for air and water quality and pollution research. The group supports policies and actions to minimise health effects associated with poor air and water quality. Now, Frank has published over 470 peer-reviewed publications on the toxicology and health effects of ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate pollution. He's also played a pivotal role in translating environmental health science into policy, and he currently advises the World Health Organization on air pollution. So, Frank, it's brilliant to have you here. So, over to you.
Thank you, Gareth. And hello, everyone. It's really good to have you with us online. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues, thank you for joining our webinar on plastic pollution under the influence of climate change. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at our lead article, which is freely available online, along with the other resources mentioned. I think we all appreciate that we live in a plastic world. And up front, I think we need to acknowledge that plastic is incredibly useful. For example, it protects us, our medicines, it reduces the weight of modern transport, it plays an integral role and part of the construction industry for offices and homes. As part of the modern clothing industry, lots of synthetic fibers and materials are used. And of course, importantly, it extends the shelf life of our food. So plastic is really, really incredibly useful. However, that changes at the end of life when they can end up looking like this, i.e. polluting the environment. Now, back in 2019, the OECD calculated that 2 million tons of plastic ends up in the environment. Most of that is macroplastic, but about 10% of it is already in a microplastic format, which you will hear more about in Stephanie's presentation. Now, major sources of these plastics are road transport, tire wear, believe it or not, tires are 55% plastic these days, and road marking abrasion is also plastic, as does paints, and of course construction and demolition activities lead to a lot of debris and plastic release. And of course our household textiles also contain a lot of plastic. So as we live in this plastic world, we also live, of course, in a climate changing world. And climate change is affecting every region of the world. The consequences that include rising temperatures leading to wildfires and degrading air quality, sea level increases due to melting ice caps, and really, really strong storms which can cause widespread ecological and socioeconomic harm. So one of the main messages we want you to take away from today's webinar is that plastic pollution and climate change are deeply interconnected. And this graph helps us illustrate some of those connections. So what we have here is global plastic production starting in the 50s and accelerating forward from about 1990. If we now layer on top of that the carbon emissions, you see that it follows the same trajectory. And then if we layer on top of that global mean temperature increases, you see that they all follow the same pattern. So this reflects in part that that plastics are predominantly made from oil and gas, and that greenhouse gases are released at every stage of the life cycle. And that's from extraction, through manufacturing, and eventually through the waste management. So how does a change in climate worsen plastic pollution in the environment? Well, this particular issue will be covered again in detail in Stephanie's presentation. As a starter, plastic just doesn't stay where we leave it. Instead, it breaks down, it disperses, and it embeds. They also accumulate chemicals and biota, as Guy will explain in the presentation following Stephanie's. As these microplastics move through food chains and start to affect wildlife across the globe. So a changing climate turns plastic into more mobile and persistent pollutants. So what we see is faster breakdown, greater leaching, enhanced absorbance of chemicals. This we see following heavy rain during floods and typhoons and storm surges. We also see remobilization of older plastics, which have been maybe trapped in landfills or put there deliberately, coming up from riverbeds and coastal sediments during flooding and erosion. And the mixing of these plastic particles when we see stronger winds and waves and shifting currents that transport and redistribute the particles through the surface water. And of course, melting sea ice that releases historical microplastic sinks back into the ocean. So climate change also turns plastic into more hazardous pollutants. In our lead article, we conducted a comprehensive review of the existing evidence that highlights how climate change crisis increases the abundance, the distribution, and exposure to these microplastics, and how they impact across ecosystems. And again, Stephanie and Guy will go by detail on these important aspects and impacts of plastic. So, investigations into the ecotoxicity of plastic pollution and the climate change are really still in their infancy. But there are many studies that have already demonstrated interactive effects in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. And they suggest that become stronger, these interactions in larger, long-lived animals towards the top of the food chain, where they're likely to experience significant microplastic exposure across the course of their life. They also adversely affect feeding and reproduction behavior of organisms that are capable of ingesting them, and this can also exceed safe levels in thresholds. So that's all the bad side of this. What we need to do is now start thinking about the solutions. What are the key policies we need to achieve to have systemic change? So some of these will, some of the priorities will require the reduction, the redesign, the reuse, the recycling. We need to cut unnecessary single plastic use. We need to make products plastic safer, reusable, and easier to recycle. And we need to create global limits on new or virgin plastic production. We need to build a circular economy, move from create, make, waste to eliminate, innovate, circulate. Combine prevention with cleanup of existing pollution hotspots. And with these shared standards, we need to agree global rules for common plastics, additives, and recycling and waste systems, and fill the data gaps and be consistent with our methodology. We need to avoid trade-offs and stay clear of fixes that cause new problems. For example, burning plastic for energy increases emissions and harms health. And bioplastics and other substances or substitutes need full safety and life cycle checks. So we need to develop better cleanup tools, the use of microbes, algae, and plants to break down or trap plastics while recognizing current limits on safety and cost and scale. Excuse me. So the solutions, they need to take an international and a coordinated approach. The world is already responding in impressive scale with examples including grassroots action and global active charities and national level product plans and initiatives to support the management of hazardous plastic waste and public-private partnerships for plastic management. But just to finish, I want to home in on the research community, because this picture, which depicts the Thinker's Bird, which was a 6-meter tall sculpture remix of Rodin's iconic Thinker, which was created for the Global Plastic Pollution Treaty negotiations last year in Geneva. The Thinker cradles a baby, sits atop Mother Earth, as entwined by a giant strand of DNA, the building block of life. And it's at this point to highlight that the growing health and environmental impacts of an unregulated plastic industry it's having on both people and planet. So the goal and the greatest hope for success would be to establish an international, legally binding global plastics treaty to end plastic pollution by transforming the way it is sourced, where it's produced and disposed of. Unfortunately, the latest round of negotiations in Geneva in August failed to reduce the treaty as deep disagreements, particularly over whether to cap plastic production and regulate toxic additives, led to a breakdown of consensus. New negotiations are planned, and we now live in hope that these will succeed. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Frank. That's got us off to an amazing start, a very thought-provoking start as well, and just showing the really important role of policy there, and the many just barriers to good policy as well, as you alluded to at the end. So, Frank, we really appreciate that very much. So, you're in for a treat now. We have our next speaker just coming to join us now, who's Dr. Stephanie Wright. Stephanie is a lecturer in environmental toxicology at Imperial, where she leads the microplastics team within the environmental research group at the Medical Research Council Centre for Environment and Health. And Stephanie's research focuses on really understanding how micro and nanoplastic exposure affects human health and disease, particularly relating to airborne plastics, respiratory toxicology, and immune responses. Stephanie has contributed to WHO and European Commission working groups. She supports evidence-based policy change and serves on the editorial board of the Microplastics and Nanoplastics Journal. So, Stephanie, over to you. Let's have your presentation. Dying to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And yeah, I completely echo Frank's sentiments. It's great to have such an opportunity to engage with people all around the globe. So great to be with you all. My talk today, or my part of the talk, is really going to focus on how climatic controls are influencing both plastic degradation, but also how plastic and microplastic pollution moves in the environment. So I just want to start by talking about how the climate is changing and just remind us of what climate change is doing. So as we can all agree, the world is getting warmer. So Earth's global average temperature has increased by 1 degree since pre-industrial levels. And behind this, we're seeing an increase in frequency and extremity of heat waves as well, sometimes exceeding 10 degrees above normal levels. So back in 2022, the UK unbelievably hit 40 degrees. Morocco hit almost 50 degrees. July 2023 was the hottest month ever recorded. And with an increase in temperature, we're also seeing an increase of humidity as well, because a warmer atmosphere increases the evaporation of moisture. So for every 1 degree increase in temperature, the saturated air can hold 7% more water vapor. And then aligned to this, we're also seeing changing weather patterns. We're seeing more extreme weather events, whether that's flooding or storms, or the heat waves as well. But also cloud cover is changing in some regions of the world. And so for Southern and Central Europe, for example, cloud cover is going to reduce at times of the year and increase UV radiation more so than before. So the reason I picked up on some of these climate factors is because they are likely to influence how plastic degrades. So we know plastic degrades faster in summer because there's an increased temperature, there's an increased UV intensity, and increased humidity in some regions of the world. So as mentioned, heat increases the processes leading to plastic embrittlement and degradation. So the processes by which plastic degrades all speed up when temperature increases. And it's been estimated that a 10-degree temperature rise could double the degradation rate of plastics. We also know that moisture and specifically hydrolysis leads to the degradation of plastic as well. So where we're seeing increased humidity, we might see the increase in hydrolysis and breakdown of some plastic types, but also this kind of alternating wet-dry cycle that we may experience will lead to these swelling, shrinking cycles in the plastic material themselves. And finally, as mentioned, UV exposure is one of the main ways by which plastic degrades. So upon exposure to sunlight, and so for some regions of the world, there's going to be more sunlight as cloud patterns change. And this leads to the embrittlement and degradation over time. And so the degradation of plastic ultimately releases microplastic to the environment. So those are some of the direct ways by which climate change might impact the degradation of plastic materials. There are also indirect ways as well. And I just want to touch on this idea of droughts and then wildfires. So following dry spells, which are being experienced more in certain parts of the world, wildfires can occur, and climate change has increased the global burned area by almost 16%. So we're seeing more wildfire coverage. Obviously, plastic pollution may be trapped in vegetation. We frequently see it as litter in the environment. And so in these areas, the plastic will also be burnt. However, the temperatures experienced are not sufficient enough and not consistent enough to fully incinerate plastic. And so this is likely to generate a microplastic release to the environment. So those are some of the extreme hot weather scenarios. I'm also going to talk about some wet weather scenarios, and particularly in this scenario, how it will change how plastic moves in the environment, so how it remobilizes and redistributes. So first of all, starting with heavy rainfall, an increase in heavy rainfall will wash plastic and microplastic from urban or contaminated areas into the wider environment. And it was shown by Hitchcock in a study in Australia in 2020 that microplastic abundance increased from a few hundred to over 17,000 particles per cubic metre of water in a river just over a 2-day rainfall spell. With rainfall, we've also got increased storms, and with storms comes an intensified wave action, which can wash plastic and microplastic ashore onto the beach. And it was shown that by Chung and Knott in 2023, microplastic in beach sediments increased almost 40-fold following a typhoon event. So droughts can also lead to higher levels of plastic pollution release, and that's because plastic litter can accumulate in dry riverbeds. And when the first rainfalls arrive, that intense rainfall leads to a first flush pulse, releasing a pulse of plastic debris, again, wider into the environment. And then finally, thinking about flooding, so extreme flooding events and coastal erosion. Most of our open landfills and dumps around the world are in low-lying flood or coastal plains. And so you can see how with flooding events, plastic in these regions may become dispersed to the wider environment. And so for a study in Bangladesh, it was shown that plastic mobilization increased 40 times during flooding. So this is all effects happening locally to regionally, and I just want to focus a little bit more on one case study looking at the effects of flooding. So this was a study published in 2018 by Rachel Hurley and her colleagues, such as Jamie Woodward at the University of Manchester, so here in the UK. It quantified microplastic in riverbeds in urban, suburban and rural river catchments across the northwest of England. And what was first found was that firstly, urban sites were high contamination hotspots, and in some cases over 500,000 microplastics per metre square were found in these sediments. And that's shown on the panel, the figure on the left, where the circles reflect the amount of microplastic recorded, and the colours refer to shape, with purple being fragments, orange being fibres, green being microbeads, and then yellow being other. However, after extreme rainfall and severe flooding events, it was found that around 70% of the microplastic loads in these sediments stored in these riverbeds were removed, were exported, and that's shown in the figure on the right there. I can also see that in a bit more detail here. So between pre and post flooding events, the total microplastic load reduced in orange, the number of microplastics reduced, microbeads reduced in green, except for some areas where there was a substantial increase. And then the number of buoyant microplastics also significantly reduced. So this all suggests that flooding can remobilize and redistribute microplastic contamination in river catchments. And I guess an overarching question here is where to, and is this leading to hotspots and high contaminant areas elsewhere and potentially vulnerable sites? So moving from regional to a more global scale, and now focusing on the ocean. And we've known for some time that the oceanic currents govern plastic debris trajectory across our oceans. And that's how we know, for example, there's an accumulation in our five key gyres, as well as in the poles. And obviously these ocean currents are shifting under climate change. So these trajectories are going to change, and these accumulation zones are potentially going to change too. The warmer oceans are also going to bring more intense tropical cyclones with strong winds and increased wave heights, and then vertical mixing of the water column. And so we're also going to see, under these types of circumstances, a redistribution of plastic debris beneath the surface. And the heat map shown here shows on the left the surface level plastic debris per square meter. Kilometre, sorry, and on the right, the heat map shows what's underneath. So during a high wind event. So just really emphasises that if you were only to look at the plastic pollution on the surface, you're overlooking the total load, and actually a substantial amount is beneath the surface, mixed into the water column. So we also touched on this in Frank's talk. So we know that sea ice is actually scavenging and concentrating microplastic from the water column. So in a study that focused on the Fram Strait, the highest microplastic concentrations found in sea ice were on the order of tens of millions per cubic metre. Found in ice cores. As you can see in the top map, a whole range of different plastics were found. So the colours in the circles refer to the plastic types. And interestingly as well, you can see that the pattern of the plastics seems to have some source influence, because they're quite different depending on whether they're lower or higher in the sampled region. The concentrations are also very variable as well. But this all just highlights that microplastic is being locked up in sea ice. And of course, we also know that sea ice is melting. And so now there's this prediction that historic sinks such as sea ice are now becoming a source as the ice melts. But I think the scales are still largely unknown. And so with that, I think I want to say thank you and hand back to Gareth.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie. And I found that so useful, just getting a real tangible idea of the mechanics behind all of this. You know, we hear all the time, of course, that there are these interactions, these very complex interactions between climate change, between plastics, but you really laid out there, you know, just what's going on, you know, how these concentrations emerge, the different climatic events and cyclones and so on that can exacerbate the problem as well. Really, really useful. Stephanie, thank you very much. Well, finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Guy Woodward, Professor of Ecology at Imperial College London and an internationally recognised expert in freshwater and aquatic ecosystem science. His research focuses on multiple stressors, including climate change, chemical pollution, acidification, species invasions, and habitat alteration. Guy leads the Natural Environment Research Council Emerging Risks of Chemicals in the Environment programme, and he serves on the board of directors of the Freshwater Biological Association. So, Guy, you're a very busy person, but we're delighted you're here today. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And thank you very much as well, Frank and Stephanie, for giving us such a fantastic coverage so far of the multidisciplinarity and scale of the challenge that we're facing. So I'm going to consider in this talk a little bit about the impacts on the sort of ecological side, and particularly how they might play out in the context of climate change, because we have both of these stressors now potentially interacting, and that has major ramifications for how ecological systems will respond. So just as an example here, if you look on the right, we have the diagram from Rökström et al. Published in Nature in 2009, and subsequent iterations have highlighted this issue around planetary boundaries and the fact that we're potentially exceeding the safe operating space for humanity, which is within the green area. And notice two of these at the top, climate change and novel entities, which includes microplastics and other forms of plastic pollution, are already moving us into the sort of danger zone, as it were. Now, one thing that hasn't really been considered quite so much is how these might potentially interact, and that's what we're going to think about a little bit in this talk. So globally, temperature, which is a key aspect of climate change through global warming, is fundamentally important. It sets the pace for life. So it determines metabolic rates, which determine a whole range of other vital rates of individuals through to populations, communities, ecosystems, and these higher levels of biocomplexity. And one thing that is often seen and predicted by theory as well is that warming tends to favour the small within and across species as well. So this aspect of the traits of species, their body sizes, and their susceptibility to warming and climate change is important. And that also comes into play, as we'll see a little bit later, with the potential impacts of plastic pollution and their exposure to them. So we've seen, as Stephanie has mentioned, extreme events such as storms, etc. These can mobilize plastics, but they can also increase the total stressor burden beyond the usual metabolic envelope that an individual organism might experience. So you're increasing the total load. And these climate impacts, they can also then interact essentially with environmental stresses. So because they interact and don't act independently, to really predict future plastic pollution impacts, you need to factor in things like climate change. And these interactions are still poorly understood. We get glimpses of them and we're starting to get a better understanding. But this is really a major space where we need to start filling in the knowledge gaps. We see growing evidence where we look globally now across different types of ecosystems of these really profound impacts on different organizational levels, from individuals through to whole ecosystems, in the terrestrial zone and also in aquatic ecosystems. So we see microplastics generated on land, for example. They enter soils through landfill or poor waste management, as Frank has alluded to. In many cases, these then get washed out into lakes and rivers in their various forms of microplastics, and increasingly into smaller particles such as micro and nanoplastics, etc. And of course, the lakes and the rivers are ultimately connected to the ocean. So there's this transfer from terrestrial through the conduits in fresh water out to the oceans. And in addition to this concern over the spread through these different ecosystem types, there are particular species within and across these ecosystems which seem to be particularly prone to their effects. And also many of these are especially vulnerable to climate change. So essentially there are some organisms that could get particularly hard by both of these stressors when they act in combination. So just as an example, some traits that could increase sensitivity include organisms that are larger, longer lived, higher in the food chain, for example. So we have this spread really from the terrestrial fanning out into the aquatic biota. So we need to consider this issue of scale and how ecosystems are linked. So we have a series of sources, sinks, and conduits effectively at these really big scales across the landscape. We can think about this really in terms of the initial encounter between the plastics and the biota through interactions with microbes in particular. And these are important because they're transformative first responders. They will often treat the plastics as biofilms or surfaces to settle on, so as habitat, but also as food sources. So microbes, and particularly things like bacteria and fungi, have a very diverse metabolic capacity. They can consume and process a wide range of different substrates, and many plastics are included in that. So they play a role there in transforming the plastics and then essentially funneling them up the food chain. The macrobiota, they of course will consume these biofilms and plastics and can contribute to the fragmentation and dispersal, so movement of them across aquatic and terrestrial landscapes. And in addition, we have this complicating factor of the consideration of natural versus artificial or agricultural systems to bring to bear. Natural and artificial systems operate under somewhat slightly different rules, so we need to understand what's happening in both of these, and particularly because artificial systems, agricultural as well as urban, are often exposed to a range of additional stresses as well as the plastics and climate change. So leakage and spillover into adjacent ecosystems is a major concern. We need to understand how these stresses move through the landscape, and also then how that plays out with climate change. So in terms of thinking about what happens then in the aquatic ecosystems, so there are some properties here which are really important in terms of both climate change and the vulnerability to plastics. Many aquatic systems are characterized by size-structured food webs. So essentially, big fish eat little fish, and these in turn eat smaller plankton, etc. So there's a size structuring in the food web. And essentially, we can think of many aquatic ecosystems, particularly in the surface waters, as being particles in solution, which are trophically connected to one another through the food web. There are certain species, such as filter feeders, for example, which can be particularly important concentrators of microplastics because they're able to pull these particles from the water column and increase their effective density within food source or potential food sources for organisms higher in the food chain. The plastics in particular are of concern because essentially in these pelagic systems, many of them have close to neutral buoyancy, so they're floating in amongst the plankton, as do the plankton themselves. And the ecological half-life of them is an important factor here to understand. If they're constantly being remixed and recirculated, they can remain in these surface waters for an extended period of time and potentially interacting with many consumers as they move through the food chain. So the freshwaters act as a gateway to the marine realm in this sense. The generation of the plastics happens in terrestrial systems and urban areas, moves into the fresh waters, and then is delivered into the marine realm where it enters the food chain. Another cause for concern, in addition to just the plastics themselves, is whether the toxic hitchhikers that can be accompanying them, such as pesticides, which adsorb to the plastics, are in fact one of the major kind of hidden attendant stressors. So one question we can ask is the plastic the threat itself or what it carries? So there are a range of direct and indirect effects we need to consider here, and we can think about this at the sort of lowest organizational levels, if you like, by starting to consider individuals and particular indicator species. So Stephanie's already mentioned, and so has Frank, that faster physicochemical degradation happens under UV and heat, etc. This leads to faster MNP generation under climate change. But warming also should increase the per capita uptake of these pollutants through individual organisms because of the elevated metabolic demands associated with warming. So essentially we have faster physical processes and faster biological transfer. Now impacts can include impaired survival, growth and reproduction of key indicator species. And this means at the higher organizational levels, when we start thinking about the food web, for instance, some species will be hit harder than others. And it's important here to think about the combination of both what we would call response traits and effect traits. So response traits would indicate species which are particularly sensitive as indicators of these stressors, and then effects traits identify species which are particularly important players in terms of influencing the wider food web or ecosystem function. If these stressors are combining to hit species which are sensitive and important in terms of affecting higher organizational levels, then their impact could be potentially very profound. And just to highlight this importance of size, if we think about plastics as different particles in suspension, well, we can also think about food webs in the same way. This shows a classic picture of how a marine food web is essentially size structured. On a log scale, we have individual body mass on the x-axis and total mass in the ecosystem on the y. Essentially what you have is a flow of energy from smaller particles into progressively larger and rarer things, terminating in these very large apex predators at the top. And this is also the direction of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, for instance. So this means particularly organisms to the far right and the bottom end of this curve are likely to be endpoints where they're hit by the effects of climate change, and they're also hit by the effects of plastic pollution. So we can think then about these direct and indirect effects and how they might flow through higher organizational levels beyond these indicator species. And this is an area where there is a major research gap at present. So most studies so far have concentrated on a few species over limited timescales and small spatial scales. What we need to be able to understand is how these pollutants move through space, through time at larger scales, and through the food web. So biomagnification is a particular concern for some of these chemicals and compounds, and that can be amplified by the presence of filter feeders in food chains, which concentrate them. So species traits are important. So body size determines where you sit in the food web. It determines your metabolism and your longevity, for instance, and also whether you're a filter feeder or a predator, for example. And impacts can then ripple through food webs, creating so-called ecological surprises. So things that are maybe counterintuitive responses that cannot be predicted simply from studying single species in isolation in the laboratory. And as I mentioned earlier, there is also this concern about long-lived toxins such as PFAS, pesticides, and forever chemicals that can absorb to these particles, whereby the chemicals that are attached can essentially be delivered through the microplastics, for instance, as toxin delivery systems to multiple points in the food web, as well as aggregating as we move at the higher trophic levels. And then this really brings us to the kind of state of the art and some of the major research gaps I think that will be of note for discussion today. We need to be able to scale up really from the lab into the future field conditions. So this will require experimentation to identify causality at more ecologically relevant scales, so bigger scales and higher organizational levels. We need to be able to link across the ecosystem types that are clearly connected, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. And then to consider how these stresses might be interacting. Is climate change amplifying, or maybe it's masking the impacts of these microplastics and associated chemicals? We can then use this to identify potential biological indicators or hotspots, so priority areas of concern or conservation, or particular focal species that allow us to develop more effective biomonitoring and intervention into the future. And then ultimately, we will take this knowledge understanding through to prediction, through development of more mechanistic predictive models, which is where we need to go before we then are able to test mitigation strategies effectively in silico and in nature. Thank you very much.
That's great. Guy, thank you very much as well for that. Absolutely fascinating. And you're really kind of outlining a bit of a roadmap of work that needs to be done, research that needs to be done, policy and science interfaces that need to come about on the back of what I thought was a wonderful detailed talk about, the metabolic effects, the mechanisms within food webs and so on. So Guy, thank you very much indeed for that. So huge thanks to all the speakers that we've heard so far. But now we're going to launch into our panel discussion. By the way, please keep your questions coming in. Right, so I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifer Provencher, who is a research scientist in the Ecotoxicology and Wildlife Health Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Her research focuses on wildlife health, especially around plastic pollution, contaminants, pathogens, and their cumulative effects on Arctic and Canadian ecosystems in this case. Jennifer leads the long-term seabird contaminants project under Canada's Northern Contaminants Programme and co-charts the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme's Litter and Microplastics Expert Group. Her work has done a whole load to help us better understand plastic pollution in the Arctic, and she's written us a viewpoint on all that in a viewpoint on the Frontiers in Science lead article. So do check that out on the Hub. And also here is Dr. Anya Brandon, a leading plastics policy expert and director of plastics policy at the Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit Ocean Conservancy. And her work bridges environmental engineering, material science, and public policy to advance ambitious science-based solutions to the plastic pollution problem. And Anya's has helped to draft landmark state and national plastics legislation, including California's SB 54 law. And that achievement saw her get recognised by Fast Company as one of the most creative people in the world in 2023. So she has an environmental engineering background and has gone on to conduct laboratory and field research on plastic degradation and microplastic pollution. Her career centres on translating rigorous science into effective policy action, and she's also the author of a policy outlook for the Frontiers in Science lead article. So it's great to have you both along. And Jennifer, just seeing as I introduced you first, let's jump in with this thought, because you're very interested in this kind of One Health approach, as you call it, all about cleaning up plastics pollution. And one of your focuses is especially around Indigenous people in the Arctic. So can you bring those together for us and tell us exactly what you mean?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really enjoyed the talks today, and I think the One Health approach is really important for Indigenous communities and many of our audiences from around the world. One Health, for those of you who don't know, has been around for about 20 years, and it its goal is to be holistic in thinking, right? So you have environmental health, you have animal domestic health, and then you have public health. And the point is to really figure out how do those come together and how do you interconnect and how do you think about those holistically. When we work with our Indigenous partners in Northern Canada and across the Arctic and across Canada and North America with Indigenous communities that we work really tight with and collaborate with, the One Health, is this inspirational thing that we use in the Western-based science. But for many of the Indigenous partners we work with, they kind of look at us like, yeah, you have to tackle everything holistically. This is not a new idea. This is a very old idea, right? Human health, environment health, food systems. This is how they have thought for thousands and thousands of years. And so we work very closely, where we study seabirds, we study whales. We have projects on seals, on walrus, on polar bears, on caribou. And we see from a Western perspective those as the ecosystem. And many of the Indigenous partners that we work with see those as the grocery store, right? Their backyard is the grocery store. They have a tight spiritual, nutritional context to the environment. And so when we're working with partners on the landscape, specifically across Canada with Indigenous partners and in the Arctic around the world, they are so voice and adamant that we bring this holistic perspective because, and I think, we heard about how it affects ecosystems, but for most of us, those ecosystems are important from an ecosystem service perspective. But for those people who are still living very connected with the land, those ecosystems provide a lot more, including, the dinner plate and the buffet for, 3 meals a day. And so I think that connection, they're very tightly coupled. And I think that is particularly important for Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also around the world for peoples who remain to have tight nutritional, spiritual, cultural connections with those ecosystems.
All right, yeah. So there's more than just one health, as it were, lots of different kinds of health. And it's so interesting that you were saying that we're talking about it as if it's something new and amazing, but the indigenous people, they'd say, yeah, we've known this is just the basis of our whole civilization. Catch up, people. Very, very important. So, Anya, I'm looking at you as our kind of plastics pollution policy person and an expert. And I mentioned there in the introduction that you drafted this. It was a landmark state piece of legislation, wasn't it? This SB 54 law in California. And I suppose my slightly thorny question to you is that of course, all of us are very aware of this retreat from internationalism. So at the global and geopolitical level, all kinds of treaties are struggling, they're breaking down because increasingly nations are putting up the barriers and they're not talking to each other. So I suppose my question to you when it comes to plastics, and it's the topic for today, is where does that leave us with good governance when we have this kind of international geopolitical breakdown, if I'm not putting it too dramatically? Where does that leave us both internationally and at the kind of state level, which of course you know a lot about, having played such a big part in drafting this law in California?
Yes, well, I appreciate you starting with an easy question. I think just by way of background, Ocean Conservancy is an environmental nonprofit that unites science, people, and policy to protect our ocean today and for generations to come. We've been around for 50 plus years, and we have been working on plastics policy and climate change policy at the state, federal, and international level throughout that time. And you're right, it is a particularly fluid landscape at the moment, but let's also be real. This is not new. We have gone through other major bumps in the road before. And I think, one of the things that I tried to articulate in this policy outlook is that no single solution or level of governance is sufficient to tackle these two deeply interconnected crises of plastic pollution and climate change. And so while state and national policies are not a substitute for the global action we do need through the Plastics Treaty and other international forums, they're a powerful tool that we can use right now to drive the systemic change that we need without waiting. extended producer responsibility, which kind of is the backbone of that law that you already mentioned, SB 54 in California, are tools that we can use to hold plastic producers and other packaging producers financially accountable for all of the plastics and packaging they are putting on our shelves. So really thinking through holding them accountable for the full life cycle of their products. This is not that different than other polluter pays types of models for policy, which helps us incentivize less wasteful products and better products in general. And I think what we're seeing now is this evolution in modern EPR systems, whether it's California's SB 54, what the European Union is doing through their new packaging and packaging waste regulation, to really try to get upstream of these issues and combine it with how we can tackle climate change. So actually forcing source reduction, using less plastics, forcing reuse. How do we transition to a more sustainable economy writ large? And so these are really powerful drivers that can reshape plastics, the plastics economy today, and also help pave the way for more of that global action into the future. The more you're doing at the state level, the more you're doing at the national level, the easier the glide path is eventually for this kind of global agreement.
Yeah, I suppose it creates that governance mindset, doesn't it, wherever you are in the world, we hope, and that can lead to better international cooperation. So, yeah, that was really useful. And yeah, I apologize for the absolutely horrible question to start off with for you, Stephanie. So let's ask, well, hopefully not such a horrible question to Frank, actually. This comes from Roman Tramoy. So, Frank, if this turns out to be a horrid question, don't blame me. This is Roman's question, who asks, regarding the high number of chemicals used in plastics, do you really think that safe, reusable and/or recyclable plastics are feasible? Isn't it a pipe dream like infinite growth? Yeah, so in fact, quite a nasty question that really, Frank. This is all just idealistic, isn't it? This whole idea of sorting out, understanding and better governance for and scientific understanding of recycling processes and additives and so on.
Well, it's a very, very important question. I think, yes, we can't be too ambitious in thinking that we can really deal with the plastic issue by removing some of the chemicals which we think are the more toxic ones. What we really do have to come up with is understanding those that are not toxic and provide the same benefit, as well as combining that with the plastic monomers themselves, which we can easily degrade or recycle. So this is a major challenge for the chemical industry, but the progress is being made. We're having, single-use plastic are being replaced already with seaweed alternatives. Here at Imperial, we have a startup company which is doing that. And we need to have the same approach with lots of the chemical additives. So it's a very good question, and there is a long journey to go here, but I think we can do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's very interesting that point about additives, because it turns out from the lead article that one of the big complications here is really understanding these additives. We might understand plastics and polymers in a fairly kind of isolated way, but the science just gets a whole load more complicated, especially when it comes to detecting plastics. When you're talking about all these different kind of additives, that's the case, isn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of these additives are proprietary knowledge. So we don't even know what's in some of the products because it's protected, the information. So that has to be sorted out. We need release of that information, and we just need to move to less toxic components, which provide the same fantastic benefit to that particular product.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in for 1 minute, I think this is a really important point that we need all hands on deck, right? 50 years ago, we were talking about plastics in seabirds and on shorelines, right? Then the toxicologists got involved. Now the material scientists or people, policy people, we need all hands on deck. It doesn't matter discipline, background, you have something to contribute here. And I think that's a really important point from a solution perspective.
Yeah. In fact, we've had so many, Jennifer, so many questions and comments about micro and nanoplastics, like this one from Vishal Dutta, who's asking, how can we accurately detect microplastics in nature? And what's the most appropriate method to remediate or remove them from our ecosystem? So, Jennifer, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The detection of micro and nanoplastics is really difficult. And the bar for peer review publication and, getting that information into policies is constantly going up. We can't just say, oh, it's plastic. We need to have, fairly fancy machines that give us polymer identification. And that is not something that should be underestimated. They are hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there is a role for, universities and governments to be able to kind of provide that service. I think that the other, so there, it's very hard. There are standardized methods. We don't need new methods. We need more implementation of existing methods. And I think the really important part is that there are microbes and there's lots of work thinking about degradation. And that is also really important. To my previous point, we need that work. We need all hands on deck. But, given the plastic additives, given the carbon release, that has knock-on effects for climate, right? For release of carbon, for release to contaminants. And so just like shoreline cleanups cannot be relied on to, keep our shorelines clean, we can't rely on microbes to break down all the microplastics. So we need parts of the circular economy to turn the tap off so we can reduce the input. And we need those mitigation techniques. We can't, as Anya and I think our panelists, Stephanie, Guy, and Frank all talked about, there is no one solution. We need to have multiple solutions at the table. And while each one of these pieces, policy bans, end user responsibility, new materials, microbes, those are all going to help us get to the end point. Not one solution is going to get us across the finish line. And that's what we need to remember. We need all hands on deck here, all solutions on deck.
Well, let's get a guy's hands on deck here, because a kind of related point here, especially when Jennifer was talking there about remediation, and Deepika Sharma wants to move the conversation on to natural carbon capture processes, Guy, and really is asking, how are microplastics interfering with that whole cycle of natural carbon capture?
Well, my answer to that, I'd have to say, is that I don't know, right? But I could imagine that there's plenty of scope for them to do so, right? So that there is evidence, for instance, in agricultural systems of microplastics in particularly associated with things like plant roots and mycorrhizae, etc., affecting uptake and plant growth. And of course, plant growth is then linked to carbon capture through photosynthesis. So if what's happening in reduced crop yields as a result of microplastics also plays out in natural systems, then there could be scope that these could be acting as a bit of a handbrake on the ability for carbon sequestration in natural systems as well. But I have to say that's well outside my field. I'm an aquatic ecologist, and in terms of the carbon capture, and particularly if you think about things like rewilding and reforesting, that's a little bit outside my comfort zone. But I could see that there would be a mechanism there by which it could come into play.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for taking that question on. Does anybody else want to develop that, or we can move on to another question? But, thank you for that, Guy, and for having a crack at that one, because I know in my own field, if I get something that's not quite my wheelhouse, I'm like, so you did a lot better than me there.
I'm happy
Okay.
to jump
Yes,
in
definitely.
on
Anya, sorry.
a related but not quite the same topic that I think Jennifer was pulling up, and I know I've seen some of the themes come up in some of the questions that we can see, which is this idea of, remediation via microbes and things that can break down our plastics. And I'll just say this is what I'd spent my early career doing, was looking at plastic degrading bacteria. And there absolutely are bacteria out there that can do that. That is not necessarily surprising. We live in a wonderful, evolving, changing planet. where there's a ton of evolutionary pressure to be able to consume and eat these incredibly high energetic particles we're putting into the world. We're just putting a bunch of carbon out there. Someone's going to figure out what to do with it. That being said, the thing that I realized and why I ended up transitioning over to policy after I finished my PhD work was it's not enough. If we are just looking at this from a remediation perspective, we are missing the far bigger picture. I, did some back of the envelope math at one point that I am not going to remember on the top of my head. And it took quadrillions of these bacteria acting across the board to deal with one single day's worth of plastic pollution, or like just pollution, let alone plastic production, right? So I think I aspire to the day we get to talk about remediation in that way, because that means we will have done all of the other pieces that are the far more low-hanging fruit to prevent plastics from getting into the environment in the first place.
Yeah. And I mean, given that these plastics do get in, and this leads me to Holly Kaufman's question, just while you're unmuted and talking to us, Anya, you might want to take this one. Like Holly's asking, what are some of the key policies, including in the short term, to deal with the toxic impacts of plastics, given that the UN treaty may or may not ever be agreed?
Yeah, great question. I think we can look at different policies, different types of policies at different levels of governance can act on different timescales. And so basically what we need to do is act across all types of policies at all governance level, because they are going to take a long time to get to our ultimate goal of a global plastics treaty that is reducing the amount of plastics we are using and polluting. But in the interim, to have that immediate positive benefit, we know there are policies out there that you can enact at the state or national level where you will see a change right away in terms of the toxic and harmful effects on the environment. Phasing out unnecessary plastics, whether that's a plastic bag ban or getting rid of, expanded polystyrene foam foodware. These are incredibly harmful once they are out in the environment. They break up into microplastics. They're well-known sources of wildlife and marine life harm. And we have really great science out there that shows that if you phase out these types of products, you see an immediate benefit and reduction in pollution in the following years, right? Like this is a very short time scale. So we need to get started with policies like that while we are working on implementing and building out the more systemic policies we need that are going to get us to that overall production reduction. How are we slowly turning off the tap? We just need to be aware of the fact that those types of things take a little bit longer. So we work on these policies in the meantime while we're actively working on these big picture policies that will slowly help us kind of turn course.
Okay. No, thank you for that. And to bring Frank into the conversation, I think Guy, you might have something to say about this as well. But I'm going to hop to a slightly different topic, but it's all related, isn't it? This one is from Benjamin D'Angelo, who says, "I'm interested in how plastics may be affecting the adaptation and mitigation, like benefits of coastal ecosystems." And by the way, folks, Benjamin's talking especially about mangrove forests, and they're thought of as being like blue carbon systems, if you like. So what, if anything, asked Benjamin, can be said about how plastics may be interfering with the adaptation and mitigation effectiveness of these nature-based solutions? So it sounds like quite a Guy kind of question. I'm going to start with Frank, but Guy, you might want to come in as well, but if you want to.
I'm going to hand straight over to Guy. I think it's definitely.
There we go. Straight to Guy.
Well, I mean, again, I think that this is a bit of a black box, right? To be honest, there is scope here for them to be affecting mangroves. I think in ways that we've seen them interfere with some of these effects at the base of the food web, for instance, particularly through the interaction between the microbes and the plants themselves, for example. Right. So I think when we think about what's happening with the microplastics right at the base of the food web, and the role of mangroves is primarily through the sort of the structure and habitat provision that they give, and then the ecosystem services around coastal protection that come from that. But ultimately, this is going to be then interlinked between the plants and the microbial interactions, which are potentially going to be compromised by the presence of microplastics. Macroplastics probably less so, would be my guess. I mean, it might be important for organisms higher in the food web associated with mangroves, for instance, sort of marine mammals and so forth. But in terms of the kind of carbon capture and those sides of things. I guess the similar challenges apply to what we discussed earlier in the other question around reforestation on land, because here we're talking about forests which are essentially at the land-water interface. So you would expect that they would be exposed to quite high levels of microplastics, more so probably than reforestation schemes. And there is scope, I think, there as well for this interference, particularly through the holobiont, right? That when you think about the higher organisms as an ecosystem in and of themselves, because they're closely coupled with these microbiomes. So the whole thing is that the holobiont. I think understanding that holobiont structure and entity around how that relates to microplastic exposure and its performance, that's probably the key here. In terms of actually giving any hard data on that, I don't have anything to hand, but I could imagine that there would be a mechanism, and if anything, I'd expect impacts or potential for impairment there would be even stronger than on reforestation in land as a result of that.
Yeah, and Frank, we're talking there. I suppose that, the idea of like ecosystems is coming up here, and we're inevitably going to talk a lot about the ocean in this context. But I'm thinking about you as a community health person, which is partly how I'm typecasting you. And it's, I don't know, maybe it's all too easy when we're focusing on the ocean or mangroves or whatever. But I don't know, maybe to eliminate the community aspect, but of course, all these things are interlinked through food chains, most obviously in food webs, but in other ways. So, can you just kind of move this on to community health and anything you think we need to take away based on really, the discussion that we've had up to this point?
Well, when we were developing this lead article in conversations with Frontiers, obviously the impact on ourselves, on humans, was brought up. But when we actually sat down to put in the various sections in the paper itself, we realized it was going to be far too expansive to cover both the ecological, the ecosystems, and the sort of health aspects of this challenge. And it is a major challenge, as you've heard from everyone. So we decided to not focus in on the community health components, but just to say very quickly, this is of great interest to us, and we're doing a lot of work in Imperial on this aspect. And most of our listeners today probably realize that microplastics are in the air we're breathing, they're in the fluids we're drinking, and they're in a lot of the food we're eating. So we're getting multiple exposures every day in every activity that we do. And that, from my point of view, I worry about the weaker components of our community, the young and the old, and those already with established diseases, and exactly what, this constant exposure to this new pollutant. I mean, it's only in the last generation that we've had these microplastics is actually contributing to our health. But I'm going to finish there because this is really conversation for another day.
Another day.
Another lead article.
Yeah, absolutely. Another lead. I like that. Another lead article. I know I took you outside the lead article there, but I just had a little sense in my waters that there might be people wondering about that aspect, who are on the call, enjoying this session today, who might just want us to talk about it a bit. So thanks for taking us beyond the lead article, but let's very much come back to territory that is on the agenda today. And I'm just looking through a few of the other questions here, and there's a very good one I saw a minute ago about how the atmosphere is a very potent and obvious, I suppose, mechanism for moving plastics, microplastics around the planet. And I'm going to put this one to you, Stephanie, because I know you've done so much work around the Arctic, for instance. And so far, we've talked quite a lot about marine systems and what have you, but not so much about the atmosphere so far. So can you bring those themes together then, maybe polar regions and atmospheric transfer?
Yeah, sure. I mean, microplastic is released to the atmosphere through many ways and is also re-aerosolized into the atmosphere through wind energy, essentially wind abrasion. And it's believed that once entrained in the atmosphere, because of the buoyancy and the low density of this material, especially for smaller size particles, they have potential to travel fairly far. we know silica particles of like 100 microns in size, for example, can travel thousands of kilometers in the atmosphere. And so you can see the analogy in how microplastic would do the same. I guess from a climate change perspective, the ways in which the atmosphere will change. Well, we've spoken about the temperature aspects, and warmer temperatures, you may expect increased buoyancy of particles in the air, and particularly microplastic in the air. So they may remain in suspension for longer in hotter environments. There's also going to be changing wind patterns, precipitation patterns. All the things we kind of covered will definitely affect how they're dispersed through air, and I guess ultimately where they're being precipitated out, where they're being deposited. You've also got increased wind, and from the sort of more, I guess, energetic atmosphere that will come with these weather patterns and storms and extreme weather events as well. So you may see, more entrainment of settled microplastics back into the atmosphere.
Yeah, all right. And that question by the way, comes from Peter Liss, who goes on to say, and I think you've touched on this, you talk about like extreme weather events and so on. So you moved it on to the effects of climate change. But Stephanie, is there anything else you'd like to tell Peter about the effects of climate change on this transfer? Because that was the other part of his question.
Yeah, I think just what I've sort of said with
Hmm.
respect to changing wind patterns and energy, I guess, if you like, and the buoyancy linked to the increased temperatures.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah.
Got it. Jennifer, I wonder if we can talk a bit more about like the One Health framework. And well, here's the thing, like one of I thought a really good example in the lead article and indeed in I should say actually in your discussion piece is when you talk about, for instance, harm reduction and unintended consequences. And for instance, you gave a very good example of maybe the unintended consequences of, we want to reduce drinking straws, for instance. Most people probably on this session would say that's a good thing, get rid of plastic drinking straws. But sometimes it's not that easy, is it?
No, and I think you have really, crystallized that. It's climate change and plastic, you know, have both brought huge benefits and are incredibly important for, lots of the population. And I think one of the things that we are learning, and I think is really critical, and I've got an 11-year-old at home. You go shopping, and I've seen lots of comments about, what is the solutions here? You're not giving us any solutions, right? And I think, even as I navigate the world as a research scientist, as someone, as an aunt, as a mother who has to navigate those stores full of packaging, is having those conversations and being really, really critical, right? Plastic bags, why did we have them, right? Why do we still need them? Where do we need them or not, right? What are those plastics that I often call essential, right? I've had to be hospitalized. I've had to have surgeries. There's lots of things. I'm only here because we have a wonderful medical system that was able to help me. There was plastic involved. But how do we, take those essential plastics and close that circular economy so we can keep all of those benefits, right? Both for humans and for ecosystems. And then having that conversation on where is that non-essential plastics. And the biggest one that we have in our house is actually probably something that some people can relate to. But in North America, we drink a lot of tea, but in tea bags, right? Not loose tea. And should we buy the tea bags that come in the big box that have one plastic wrapper, or like every individual wrap tea bag, right? These are little things, but I think the point is really having that conversation about where is it needed, where is it not, where does it benefit us, and where is it might be important to someone else. And I think, that the straw, the plastic straw, those types of arguments, and just really thinking about where and why we're doing those actions is really important. And in knowing that it's very personal. And I'll give you another example. Plastic water bottles are another big one that I've seen where people have really jumped on it, right? for many of us, it's really easy to get a stainless steel water bottle, bring it to work, right? Reduce your plastic water bottle consumption. But in, linking back to climate change, we saw that when we have huge hurricanes, when we have earthquakes, in Canada, we have First Nations communities that do not have safe drinking water. Plastic water bottles are incredibly important tools for human safety, human health, emergency responders. Being able to provide, access to clean drinking water is a fundamental human right. And so again, that's another example of, plastic bottles. It's easy to say, oh, we don't need them, let's get rid of them, but without thinking about who needs that and why do those exist. And I think one of the things that we can all do, we do this in my lab that studies plastic pollution, really critical think about where can we put down and stop buying and turn off our own personal tap for that non-essential plastic. But then where is that essential plastic? And that's not going to be the same answer for everybody. And then I think that's part of that dialogue and those regional solutions, right? Banning plastic water bottles might be the solution in one community. It's not going to be the solution in every community. And having that, that dialogue and kind of, I'm going to end on that positive, right? Having that conversation with people learning is that critical piece.
Right. Okay. No, I was just wondering whether to keep my plastic water bottle out of shot during this session. So
at least it's reusable, right? And that's a great solution for you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can I pick up on one theme that you were getting there, Jennifer? And I know we're almost out of time here. I think that it's so amazing for us all to be able to have those conversations. And when we are presented with limited choices, there is not a conversation. So part of this broader change is putting it back on the folks who are shoving all of this plastic in our face, right? I think, Frank, you were the one who mentioned this, microplastics are a problem of this generation. Our store shelves have changed within our generation as well, right? We can go back and look very easily at, I did not used to have a triple wrapped cucumber in the produce section. My bananas came unpackaged because it turns out nature's got that one for us, right? So thinking through that challenge of necessity, but also and where plastics are needed and essentiality, but also pushing back a little bit on those producers to make sure they are providing options for all of us at a cost parity, right? We don't want just a bunch of boutique refilleries that are going to price out the folks that might be most impacted by the production and pollution from plastics. We want to make sure this is accessible to everyone. And that's really how we get to that big picture system change of using less plastics.
Very important. Okay. Well, we are now into the final 10 minutes already. Would you believe it, folks? So what I'm going to do now is to start to just kind of bring things to a little bit of a kind of like a nice gentle stop, not a full stop, but I'm going to go round the panel and just get each of you to give us your final thought, really. Your big one really important, massive point that you haven't managed to get to yet because that awful chair didn't ask you that question that you were hoping they were going to. This is your chance, all of you, and you only have a minute each to do it. So, Frank, start us off. What do we need to take away from your brain?
Hopefully I'll take less than a minute and give other people more time, because I worry, and my worry is that as energy and transport systems decarbonize, petrochemical plastics will remain a growth area for fossil fuel companies. Plastic production is projected to triple by 2060. So today we've heard about the problems we have, and one of the main solutions is to turn off the tap. But we seem to be going in the other direction. So that is my major concern. And by driving the increased use of petrochemical into plastics, we're going to get all the associated emissions as well. So we're going to have lots of other sideline issues like bad air quality as a consequence. So that's my problem.
All right. Thank you, Frank. So, Jennifer, your final minute. What haven't I got you to say so far?
Yeah, thanks. I think I want to reemphasize a couple of points just seeing in the chat. I think one thing I am always trying to emphasize is that there are many, many kind of standardized protocols for assessing plastic pollution and macroplastics in the environment. We are not started from scratch. If you are new, there is lots of available. We should not be, every time we think about something new, a new way to detect, we're actually detracting from comparability, harmonization, and monitoring, which is a really big one. I think that the last piece I want to just leave everyone on a note is, I touched on this earlier, but no longer can we just pick up a piece of plastic and say, oh, it's plastic. Polymer identification is a huge piece of the research. And given that the UN treaty is probably going to list by polymer identification is going to be increasingly important for all research. And yet the polymer identification machines, FTIR, Raman, OPTIR, LDIR, GC pyrolysis, often come with 5 or 6 digit, invoices, which are beyond most NGOs, most universities, and are even limited within the government department. So I think we need to have a real think about how do we support big and little organizations in understanding the fate and transport of microplastics in the environment.
Like being equitable.
With an equitable networked solution.
I've got it. Great. Jennifer, thank you. Sorry to rush you. Guy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest thing that we need to address now really is to be able to get out into the field and to really identify causality at scale. That there's a huge amount of work has been done in laboratory ecotoxicology, etc., and at the other end, in the observational scale in the natural environment. But to understand some of these mechanisms, some of these black boxes or gaps were highlighted in the questions around things like reforestation, carbon sequestration, etc., in natural ecosystems. But we need actual experimentation done at scale to be able to understand the mechanisms behind that. And that's a massive gap that is currently waiting to be plugged.
Yeah. Okay. And Anya, your final big, massive statement at the end.
I'll try to end on a positive note. I think data leads to awareness, which leads to engagement, which leads to action. And I'll just say we have and continue to have the knowledge and the science of this problem. We have the policy tools we know can and help immediately address this problem. So what we need now is political will, engagement, and really coordinated action to get moving. We simply cannot afford to wait.
Okay, we can't afford to wait. An urgent message there from Anya at the end. Stephanie, I'm sure you're equally urgent, but your final thoughts.
I think my final thought is just that our communication moving forward, whatever sector we're in, is careful and considered. There are lots of nuances. Recently we've seen headlines that models are underestimating atmospheric microplastics. There's still tens to hundreds of quadrillions of microplastics being released to the atmosphere. So it shouldn't really take away from that issue. And I think moving forward with climate change and plastic pollution, we really need to think about our messaging being accurate and not, I guess, taking away from the issue necessarily.
Okay, no, very important. All right. And seeing as you've all been brilliant and on time, I can give you each a final, where this is like a yes or no, basically. Horrible question right to the end. Are you optimistic about the future in your respective field? Yes or no? Frank, are you optimistic?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not in my lifetime.
Not in your lifetime. Okay, good. A qualified no, not really, but maybe eventually. Jennifer, how about you?
I am, and I'm going to pull the Canadian card here. I am ever optimistic that we can work together and really come together with the technologies we have at hand.
Oh, optimism breaking out from Jennifer. Guy, how about you?
I'd like to say I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think I'll probably err on Frank's side and say that in reality, probably I am rather pessimistic at this stage.
Fair play. You see, you're not Canadian enough.
No,
Stephanie,
unfortunately not. I'm quarter Canadian, if that counts.
Oh, well, okay.
Not
Well, that
quite
can
enough,
be your
yeah.
optimistic part, and then the rest of it is less so.
Yeah.
Stephanie, yes or no? Optimistic?
I'm more optimistic about one than the other. I think I'm more optimistic at this point in time around plastics than I'd say, yeah.
And Anya?
Yes, I'm definitely optimistic. We have already seen change happen, I think, as one small small anecdote. It took decades to start negotiating a global treaty on climate change. We're already doing that for plastic pollution. And while we have road bumps and stoppage ahead, we're already underway.
All right. Well, there we'll leave it. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Frank Kelly, Guy Woodward, Stephanie Wright, Anya Brandon, and Jennifer Provencher. And of course, thank you all for joining us today. Really hope you've enjoyed the session. Just before we go, quick reminder, do visit the Frontiers in Science website to read the article we've been discussing today and all its related content, plenty of it. You can continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag FrontiersIn, that's hashtag FrontiersIn, and be sure to subscribe to Frontiers in Science updates. The link will be posted in the chat. Check it out, and you can visit the Frontiers Forum website for upcoming events. In the meantime, it just remains for me, Gareth Mitchell, and all of us here at Frontiers, the amazing team who've done such a brilliant job today, many late nights putting this together. Thanks to them, and thanks to you most of all for being here. Goodbye.